Welcome to an all brand new episode of Talking the Witcher. I am one of your hosts, Kinte, all the way live from Los Angeles, California, and I am so happy to be here with you today. This is a brand new venture with me and my wonderful co-host, Jen. And Jen, this is a show that you really championed. And tell us about yourself as well as why you wanted to cover this show.
Okay, well, obviously, I'm Jen. I live in a little tiny island on in the middle of the Pacific called Maui. So sometimes in the background, you may hear some of our native wildlife, including a rooster. Just got to throw that out there because it seems to come up kind of often. The Witcher is one of the series that I really wanted to do. And Kinte and I have done quite a few of these. But I championed this one because there is such a awesome sort of trifecta of information out there about this series. One is, of course, the original books that were written, and they're amazing. It's just an unbelievable high fantasy epic that all sort of get into about how they treat some of our story material and then how the series is treating it as well. But then we also have the games, which were wildly popular, especially The Witcher 3, and they've seen a resurgence lately in popularity, and that is really exciting too. And the interesting thing about this is that the games actually add almost a different layer of lore to The Witcher than the books did. It all draws from the books in terms of what the basic mythology is, what the basic lore is, and there's a lot of Eastern European mythic structure that some of us may not be super familiar with, but then there's lots of stuff in here that is really familiar to all of us. And actually in the first episode that we're going to get into, there's an awesome story parallel, which I can't wait to sort of discuss. So the reason that I wanted to do this is because there is all of this information out there. There's all of these convergences, and yes, I'm using that word on purpose, of the story material, and much like the world of The Witcher, these convergences lead to all kinds of interesting little side alleys and little storylines to go down. So I'm really excited to talk about this. And Kinte has not seen The Witcher all the way through. And in terms of the series, this is my fourth watch through, I think, or possibly, yeah, at least four. I have read all the books. I have played all the games through. There's some story mods that I haven't actually used yet, which I'm super excited to try, but there's just some small things that I haven't done. But overall, I think you could call me a fan. So that's basically it about me and what I am hoping that we get to accomplish in this.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on what Jen is saying, I've only seen the first episode. So each podcast we do, the only information I'm going to have is whatever episode we are covering. Also, I've never played a Witcher game or read any Witcher books. I have no idea what's going to happen in this season. So, this is going to be brand new. So this is, so I just completed watching the first episode. And so Jen is driving this ship, and I'm going to try to add whatever I can add to it. I hopefully, as I go along, I will be able to add a little bit more to the conversation, being that I only watched the first episode and not as clear on everything as I like to be. So I'm gonna really just kind of piggyback off of Jen and try to add, what I can to it, and hopefully, as the story goes along, and it becomes more clear, all the facts, everything that's going on, that I'll be, a better podcaster when it comes to this material. So, kind of, if you can you kind of give people who, I don't know why you would, haven't watched the show and then listen to this podcast, but like, who's in it and that kind of business.
Well, first of all, just so that we're super clear, right? I won't venture too far into books or video games, except perhaps to bring out, by contrast, maybe how some things are done a little bit differently, and because they have made significant changes to storylines in the series, and I think that we should really concentrate on the series because that's what's being presented for us. So, I don't want to get into why one might be better or another might be, more. If it adds to the explanation, then great, then I'm here for that. If it gives a little bit of background, I'm here for that too. And of course, you can lean on me to ask any questions that might be sort of nebulous. But just overall, I just want people to know that I really am leaning into the series as presented by Netflix and not leaning into the books per se. It is a very wide world in his books. It's just a fantastic, huge, epic story. So that piece.
Oh, okay. We're having a little technical difficulty with Jen. So as we wait for her to come back, I want to acknowledge everybody who was listening. And
I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
No,
my studio decided to quit on me.
Just some technical difficulties, but you are back, and
Awesome.
Continue where you left off.
What was the last thing that you heard me say?
You were just going into the kind of the overall piece about the series.
Okay, well, let me give a bit of background. So there's the series of books which were written by a man who is now in his 70s, named Andrzej Sapkowski. And the Witcher series is what the video games are based on, and also what the Netflix series is based on. Now, we know from Netflix that they are trying to follow the books as much as they can, and not necessarily the video games. But you can see in the visual style that Netflix has chosen to adapt that they rely heavily on some video game awesomeness. So there are definitely components and aspects of it, but story-wise, I think we're leaning into the books a bit more. So in terms of who we have as the cast, the Witcher, who is Geralt of Rivia, who we'll sort of get into about, what his backstory is and things like that as the series progresses, is played by, it's almost even hard for me to see him as not being Superman, but Henry Cavill. We also have, which we didn't see in the beginning episode, so maybe I'll skip over that one. We have Freya Allan, who plays Ciri. We have kind of a cast that are filled with some people that we know, some people that we don't know, some interesting knowns, some, I think, really interesting casting choices just in terms of who looks like who. And one other thing that I just wanted to quickly mention about how they did the casting here, what's funny to me is the main person, Henry, he actually, I guess, pitched to get this role. He's a huge video game fan and apparently a huge book fan too. And he has done several sort of vignettes that are all produced by Netflix about the sword fighting, about some of the backstory, and it's really interesting to watch. So I highly suggest that if you want to see another, geeky person talk about The Witcher, listen to what he has to say, because he's got some really cool insights. So that kind of wraps that up, I think.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So the first episode is entitled "The Ends at the Beginning." So you want to kind of talk about what you believe is the reason for that title?
Well, like I said, this is my fourth watch through now, and so I know what sort of these things mean, but it is a little bit spoilery. So I think maybe I won't say exactly what is going on here, but I will say that there's so many clues in this episode that feel to rob from another story timey-wimey. Everything is extremely and I think that they actually do a really good job with this by setting stuff up in sort of these takes, the scenes that happen between the court, basically, with Queen Calanthe, and what's happening with the Witcher as we are introduced to him as he comes into this place called Blaviken. The thing that I think is most interesting is if you listen to the dialogue, you'll hear inconsistencies, and there's a reason for those inconsistencies. And I am super interested to hear what you thought about that, or if you even picked up on any of that.
No, I didn't. I did not pick up on the inconsistencies. Because when you first start a show, you're kind of not really sure who's who or what's what. So, if you can give us some insight.
Well, a couple of things that happen specifically around Calanthe and what people say about her is we hear Ciri talk about how Queen Calanthe, won her first battle when she was Ciri's age. This is when they're at the banquet. Okay?
Right.
Okay, so that's one piece, and we hear that, and so we know that as a young person, she definitely did some very great things. Now, fast forward to the conversation that Geralt is having with Renfri in the forest, and you'll hear Renfri say, Queen Calanthe just won her first great battle.
Okay. I didn't.
So, yeah, and I didn't pick up on that the first time through either. It completely went right over my head. But this is one of the things that going forward is actually pretty important.
Oh, okay. All right. So you got to pay attention to the details.
To a degree, yeah. It's not the kind of show that like every single detail matters in the sense that they're trying to hide Easter eggs or anything. But the way that this story is told, which will become apparent shortly, there's a bit of ambiguity in how things are unfolding, and it's done, I think, for a really good reason. And in the end, it does really work out really well. But it's a bit confusing at the beginning. So if there is a way to sort of help people to understand what that is without being too confused, I think that that's actually a good thing.
Oh, okay. All right.
So in the very beginning, in that very first scene, I just wanted to briefly touch on that because as an introduction to who Geralt is, Geralt's a monster hunter. Witchers are monster hunters. And we see him fighting this Kikimora. And it kind of looks like a giant spidery sort of thing. And one of the most interesting things that I heard people say was, well, why did they make Geralt look like such a monster in the beginning? He doesn't look like that when he goes into Blaviken. What's going on with that? And this episode doesn't go into detail about what is happening there, but I just wanted to say that there's a really good reason for that. There's a very specific reason that he looks very different when he's fighting that monster than he does when he goes into Blaviken to try to sell the monster.
Mm-hmm.
What'd you think about the monster itself?
Oh, it was frightening. It was a great beginning. It puts you right into it, and it was a great battle. It looked really good. So it lets you know right away that it's going to be high, production value.
Definitely. Yeah, I felt the same way. And that sword that he's fighting with is a silver sword. So it's really expensive. It's very, it's obviously not a super heavy metal. And Geralt relies on that sword a lot. But that is his silver sword.
Oh, okay. All right.
So the other thing that I wanted to just point out in that very beginning piece is one of the things that I saw when I first watched the show was how sort of true to form it feels in terms of video game. Like you could actually feel yourself being in the middle of that as almost first person perspective fighting the monster. I really appreciated that. Felt like that was a huge shout out.
For the the people who love the video game.
Yeah, it definitely felt like it was right there. There's another part of the episode that also feels like it's right out of a video game, and that also made me think of the same thing. But this I think was a really good introduction.
Yeah, I agree.
So almost the next thing that we kind of see with Geralt, because I'll go back and forth with the Queen Calanthe and Cintra storyline as well. But the next thing that we see with Geralt is he is going into this town called Blaviken, and it's a fishing town. So if they're poor, it's pretty reliant on fishing as their main trade. And there's this market, and the market is a really big deal. It's pretty much the only thing that these people have going for them right now. And he goes into this pub and he meets this person. Well, the first thing that happens is he's confronted by the innkeeper or the barkeeper and a group that clearly don't like him. And it sort of sets up this idea about people don't really like witchers. Did you get? I'm sure that you got that.
Oh yeah. He was being discriminated against based on his race.
Based on his race. Well, so there's, in fact, I don't really think it kind of gives anything away to say that in this world, witchers are not revered, monster hunters are not revered, and they don't at any time really talk about what creates this the situation whereby witchers are unwelcome. And just to give you kind of a little bit of pre-story background, a long time ago, there was this thing that happened with the worlds, which if we were to think about it kind of in a standard term, it would be a little bit like multi-universes collided, or maybe not universes, but different dimensions sort of collided. And they call them spheres. And the event that happened was called the convergence. And so what ends up happening is during the convergence, when these spheres meet and collide, things that don't exist in one world get to exist in that world, and other things can happen. It sort of breaks the balance of that world. And the monsters that are all over in this world basically are there because of that convergence. And the witchers were created to fight the monsters. And only the witchers have the ability to understand, because they do such huge, which I think we'll get into in season 2, research into who the monsters are and what they do and what their weaknesses are and all of that. And they're given special power to be able to do it. So in the first scene, we don't really see Geralt using too many special powers. Everything that he's doing is with his sword and sort of his superhuman strength. But that's kind of the basic behind that. So he walks into this place, he meets the bartender, and he also meets this woman who kind of saves him from what might end up, being a bar brawl. I love the line from the bartender that says you can leave on your own or you can leave in a noose or something like that. I love that. I thought that was great. That really shows how much they really hate him. And the poor guy, he hasn't even done anything yet. So what did you think of that? Just the scene in the bar itself. What did you get from it?
I think it's just kind of, it's a typical scene where they're trying to kind of give you the lay of the land as far as how he's perceived by people who don't even know who he is. I mean, they don't really know who he is. They just know what he is or what he does. So, I didn't take much of it. Just that, it's just letting you know how people see him and view him. But my thing is like this is what I don't understand is why do they think they can take him when he clearly is more powerful than they are?
Okay, so a couple things. Most witchers are very averse to killing or hurting humans. It's just a thing. They kill monsters, and Geralt in particular has a reputation for not wanting to hurt people. He doesn't see that as his primary goal. And witchers are not invulnerable to hurt and harm. They absolutely positively can be hurt, which we see actually much later in the episode, but they can be killed just as, maybe not just as easily, but they can still be killed. So I think what was happening in that scene was there were 6 of them, 6 of the guys, and I think that they thought that they could easily overtake him with just sheer number.
Oh, so they're thinking, okay, it's a lot of us. We can take this one guy, but this one guy is, is superhuman.
Also, the other thing which exists in this world, which is not very well explained in the series at all, is, witchers have different kinds of abilities. So it's not, there's so much myth and lore out there about who witchers are, and a lot of disinformation. So I don't think everybody really knows exactly what he can do, and they don't know his level of proficiency with either the sword. I mean, he's Geralt. They don't know who he is at this point necessarily. Like, he doesn't have the huge reputation that that later we'll sort of learn, maybe he kind of earns. But at this point, we don't have any of that. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. It kind of feels like is one of those westerns where it's a gunslinger comes into town. Yes. And he's like the fastest gun, that kind of deal. So it feels very like it's like a western almost.
Yes.
And I think that's what they were going for, right?
I think you're absolutely right. That is 100%. Yeah. And it's also, there's, I think that in the beginning, what we're supposed to understand here, including his first meeting with Stregobor, is that Geralt has a very specific code of honor that keeps him, or tries to keep himself from doing things that cross the line for him morally. He just has his own set of moral codes. Now, what is perhaps, I think, the most interesting is, even in this episode, that's tested to that he basically has to make the very choice that he just said that he doesn't want to have to make. And this is sort of a recurring theme with Witcher. It is always about which is stronger, free will or destiny. And, oftentimes it seems like destiny has the upper hand, and free will just kind of comes in a little bit afterwards weakly and goes, oh yeah, I'm still here. So there's that. I wanted to touch on Renfri real quick. So we'll talk a little bit about her story, but I wanted to straight up say that Renfri is absolutely a Snow White derivative. Renfri, so there aren't 7 of them, but there are 6. Renfri has a band of men. They're not dwarves, but there's this direct correlation. Where Renfri's story is, she was sent out so that she might possibly survive, and instead was let go because in sort of a change up, but still she got let go, and then hunted again. And it's sort of almost a pretty direct parallel between that story and Renfri's story. So with that in mind, what did you think of Renfri?
And she's the young lady who later, at the end,
ends up confronting Geralt. Yes,
right.
In the books, I believe she has a different name. I think actually she adopts the name of Shrike. But for the Netflix purpose, her name is Renfri.
Okay, I wanted to make sure that I didn't get it confused with the younger. Let me we're talking about her right here.
Yes, that's Renfri, right?
All right. Okay, so one thing that I got from her character is, that she's obviously in this, in this harsh environment or this harsh world that, is tough to be anybody, but especially, a woman in this world. And she's had to live her life like, um, you know, uh, she had to live a tough life, a hard life, which has made her hard, and it's made her, somebody who's formidable.
Right.
Um, I would say that without, going into, how everything turns out for her, I enjoyed her character. I felt like her character was I feel like she kind of gives you an insight onto the people that are going to be into this world that we're going to be seeing
Right.
on this show. So, you know, um, well, I mean, look, if anybody's listening to this podcast, they've seen this episode. So, she's a strong character to meet her demise pretty early in the story. I mean, you want to see, I guess, the way they set her up, you could have seen more of her character. It's unfortunate, and the actress does a fantastic job.
Right. Her name is Emma Appleton.
The actress, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And, I definitely want to sort of deconstruct that fight scene at the end, but I want to say that the character, as they present her in the series, is kind of an amazing peek into both, like you said, what's happening in the world itself right now, and also as it relates to Geralt and his decisions, what he decides to do, and how he decides to confront what he considers to be evil, I guess I would kind of put in quotes, but the wrong side. Um, and Renfrey really sort of brings out in him this conflict of, okay, what makes you a monster? And he, I think, decided the moment that she made the choice to cross blades with him that she was indeed the monster. And what was fascinating to me about the choices that we see them kind of struggle with a bit as they're having one-on-one dialogue out in the forest is that Renfrey has a really good reason for wanting to kill Stregobor. And I think in some ways maybe Stregobor sort of has, to me, it feels misguided. But I think in terms of who the character is, he sees a perfectly good reason to want to kill Renfrey. Now, the most fascinating part to me about this is why he would want to kill Renfrey and not why he would want to kill Geralt. Because Geralt and Renfrey are cut almost from the same cloth. So there is the levels of ambiguity that are happening around character choices are clearly far more reaching than what we are even allowed to peek into as we see those interactions happening. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. And it's I hate to invoke this, but people were kind of trying to say this might be the new Game of Thrones. When I say new Game of Thrones, meaning the fantasy show with political intrigue and that kind of thing. So so far we have obviously that's a big those are some big shoes to follow. So
And,
do you
and
feel, and just as a side note, do you feel like, because this came out, not long after Game of Thrones,
right.
and there's a lot of people hoping that it would fill that void. Do you feel like maybe that it's unfairly getting put that kind of tag on, that it needs to live up to that, even though the different it's different material, different studios producing it, it's just exists in the fantasy space?
A little, because Game of Thrones and specifically George Martin had a very different um, overall tone for his high fantasy story. This is it's really different. I'll give you a great example. George Martin, although he didn't always write everything specifically linear, for the most part, everything that happens in the entire epic, Song of Ice and Fire, is told narratively linear. In the Witcher series, it's more like an anthology, loosely, of what Geralt does, what has happened to him, pieces of things that make sense in the world, and then a narrative. So it's a lot more, in some ways, fragmented than the narrative is more fragmented than the Game of Thrones narrative. And where the Game of Thrones narrative also relies very heavily on a kind of internal dynamic between kingdoms, and specifically as they relate to, who has the most power. Witcher is not, it feels like it's building toward that, but it really isn't that. It really is about a kind of, this is the world of making moral choices. It is in a very similar way to the way that we understand our world by reading fairy tales and myths and legends and epic poems and things like that. Witcher has a very similar feel to it, in the sense that it gives us a kind of framework by which we can see how people who have really difficult choices get to make them. And whether or not the question, or not whether or not, but whether the overriding idea of destiny and fate make a difference in a person's life, or whether they get free will as sort of their ultimate bottom line, this is my trump card. And Game of Thrones didn't have as much of that. In some ways, I wish Game of Thrones did. But in this world, it's quite a bit different. So, yes, in some ways, I feel like, yay, if you are here for something that fills the void of high fantasy epic like Game of Thrones. But you'll never get what Game of Thrones gave you, because it's just too different of a story.
Right. And honestly, that's probably not a good way to judge your watching stuff, is based on something else. Like, enjoy it for what it is,
Well, I do think that there is a bit of this that is important, and that is, like, look, I love the horror genre. The horror genre to me is my most favorite and most comfortable place to be. I absolutely adore it. So I will watch B movies. I will watch terrible movies sometimes. I watch Attack of the Killer Donuts. I will watch whatever it is within that genre, because I enjoy the genre. And I think if you are looking for something that is high fantasy and you enjoy high fantasy, you will enjoy this, but you won't get the same level of three-dimensional chess that you do out of Game of Thrones. It just isn't built that way. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. And I agree.
This is definitely not afraid to, this series is not afraid to not take itself seriously. And when I say that, I mean, there are so many shout outs to the video game. I mean, it approaches breaking the fourth wall without breaking the fourth wall. But I mean, there's so many references to the actual video game itself. And then there are all of these references, obviously, to the source material of the book. But it just feels like, it's not afraid to laugh at itself in a way that is, to me, really refreshing. It doesn't feel like it is so incredibly serious that you have to be a high fantasy scholar to enjoy it. You really get the sense that it feels like this is fun for the sake of it being action adventure.
Right.
That's my feeling, anyway. So if we can move over to the story of Nilfgaard, Queen Calanthe, and Ciri. There, a lot of things are going to, in fact, in the next episode, we're going to see quite a few things that will bring what just happened into further disarray. But in this episode, what we see is Calanthe, who is obviously a very strong queen.
Right here.
And yes, and her husband, who is now the king, and obviously they try to really play him up as being a rogue. Um, when they are talking and having kind of their back and forth, it feels very much like they are what's a good word? They're very comfortable with each other. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And how did you feel that the relationship was between all of them, both at the banquet and even before? Because I sometimes I wonder if I see maybe more into it than other people do.
I mean, they just seem like they seem like characters who are obviously looking to be, looking for power and their place in the world. And it just came off to me, just, I mean, I didn't really put a whole lot into it because this is like kind of the opening stuff. So
Right.
I don't know if I took anything necessarily out of it, substantial. It's probably one of those things when I go back, I'll see it more.
Well, so a couple interesting things that happen in especially the banquet scene. We're introduced to somebody, a magician, who is a little bit different than the magician who is Stregobor, but his name is Mousak. That's one. He's kind of an important character, and we see quite a bit of him in this episode. And then we also see Iced. Iced is Calanthe's husband. They, at this point, have been married for, I think, 13 years or so. And Nilfgaard, when it invades, the reason that I think that scene is so important is because it shows that Calanthe, as much as she is prepared, and as much as she believes that they are sort of invulnerable in Cintra, Nilfgaard has managed to invade very quickly. And you also hear reference, which I'm just going to throw out there as, hey, this might be important, that they had to get through Sodden first. That's a bit important. So think about that. That's actually, I think, an important piece. But Cintra itself is a kind of, what's a good word for them? They're a little bit condescending in the sense that, well, Calanthe is, in the sense that she really doesn't believe that anything bad will ever happen to Cintra. She really believes that they are absolutely positively prepared. And you heard her tell Ice tell her that Skellig was sending 50 ships. And while they're on the battlefield, you find out that those 50 ships were lost at sea. So there is no help that's coming for them in that final battle scene, when basically Nilfgaard wins the day and Calanthe is sent wounded terribly back to Cintra. And so just from sort of an overall standpoint, that piece is kind of it's a peek into what is happening sort of all over the place. Nilfgaard is attacking from the north. They are a northern kingdom, and they have unleashed themselves on all of the kingdoms below them. So this is kind of a big deal. How did you feel about both the battle and sort of what ended up happening?
The battle was pretty awesome. I mean, it has that scope, of it has that giant scope of all the men and everything, and it looked great. So one thing I'm looking at is, okay, what's the production quality at? Trying to figure out who the characters are and how they relate to each other. And so when the battle, it was really cool because it shows that for me it's more so, okay, this show is going to be on a certain level as far as quality.
Yeah.
So how it relates to people, I'm still trying to figure that out.
Well, and I think one of the things about the battle that we can infer is that, and you can see it pretty clearly, Cintra was really overrun by Nilfgaard. I mean, when you see how many people or how many soldiers are in the Nilfgaard army, and then lined up in reserve up on top of the hill. I mean, it feels pretty overwhelming in comparison to Calanthi's army and to Cintra's army. So, you get the feeling that Nilfgaard is pretty organized and very powerful. So that's a big deal. I feel like that's a huge deal.
Right.
And also we just met Iced and now he's dead. So there's that. Calanthe, we meet her in this episode and she dies. She dies jumping out the window. And I'll have a lot more to say about that in later episodes because it ties in directly to something that happens later. It was a big question for a lot of people about why she chose to take her own life as opposed to, trying to survive. But if you'll notice, everybody else in the castle also took their own lives. And there's a really good reason for that. But I don't want to spoil anything, so I want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about things episode by episode. But that was, it was telling that they spent so much time on people committing suicide, basically, rather than being captured by the Nilfgaard army.
Right.
Did you catch that?
Yeah, it made perfect sense. It's like, what would you rather, especially when you're that high up, what would they do to you? What kind of things lied for you?
Yeah, and there's also more specific reasons behind that as well. But again, we'll get into that in a bit. So the other thing that I wanted to quickly touch on was Ciri. So Ciri is the granddaughter of Calanthe. At this point, we don't know what her actual parentage is, but we do know that she is Calanthe's granddaughter. They call her the Lion of Cintra, or I'm sorry, they call her the Cub of Cintra. They call Calanthe the Lion of Cintra. And she has a rather unique power, which we saw unfold in this episode. And again, I won't get too far into what that is, but it is pretty amazing. The scene where she is being chased and the level of destruction that she is able to wield on the land to create that chasm is absolutely astounding. I mean, from a visual perspective, it really left me breathless. I was really impressed by the way that they did that. What did you think?
Oh, heck yeah. It was pretty dope. Like, and once again, showing you what, and this is just the first episode, so if it's going to be like that in the first episode, what can we get going forward?
It seems pretty obvious that Ciri doesn't have any idea of what kind of power she actually has. She's just trapped and lashing out. And that ends up being the way that she can protect herself. I don't think at this point we should infer that she knows anything about. In fact, Calanthe, I think, even mentions at one point that she thought that it might skip her. So we know that there's something familial going on with that power. But she hasn't been given any information about it. So she wouldn't know how to wield it, even if somebody said to her, "Oh, you have this." Nobody's trained her how to do anything. That to me was actually kind of cool. I liked that a lot. And then the last thing here is Renfri's dying words. Renfri's dying words were, "The girl in the forest will be with you always. She is your destiny." And what do we think that means? Me
personally, I feel like.
Yes, when I say we, I actually mean you.
Right. Me personally, I feel like it's saying that your imperative is her. That's what you are meant to do.
Is who?
The girl. I don't know her name. I haven't.
Ciri. You're talking about Ciri.
Ciri, right?
Yeah, the young girl, right? Queen Calanthe's granddaughter.
The rat killer.
Yes. No, that's not the rat killer.
No. Okay, my bad.
No, the rat killer was the alderman's daughter, and
okay, I got it mixed up. My bad.
Right, she was actually a resident of Blaviken. So Calanthe's, Princess Ciri is actually, we see cutscenes to her separately. And you're absolutely right that Renfri's last words are to remind Geralt that destiny basically can't be screwed with. That, look, your destiny is waiting for you. You know, stop trying to mess around with it.
Okay.
So that, I think, is. I mean, there's lots of things in this episode that if you. Okay. One last. Sorry, I know I said that was the last thing, but this really is sort of an important part. The fight scene that happens as Geralt enters the Blaviken Square is, you know, I mean, it feels like it came directly out of the video game, just sort of whole cloth. I mean, not that any one of those pieces is like from the video game, but it had that feeling to it. And if you watch, again, I'm just going to go back to one of the things that makes the series so great. If you watch the deconstruction of that fight scene that Henry Cavill goes through, it's really amazing. The level of stunt work and the level of choreography that is happening in that fight scene alone is unbelievable. And the thing that just astounded me about that, even before I saw him deconstruct it, was that it is all one take. It is, the camera work is so amazing. It's so unbelievably astounding that they were able to do everything in that scene in one take. There is not a single cut. And, you know, talk about production value. Any one thing that could go wrong, if it had gone wrong, would have totally interrupted, and then they'd have to start it all over again. And I have to wonder how many times that happened. But it was amazing from the viewer's standpoint to feel like you are right inside of every single action piece. It felt intimate and personal, that fight scene. Like, you know, not only do we get to know how Geralt fights in close quarters, but we sort of get to feel how he operates with the sword. The sword is such an extension of who he is that it's almost, he bats away a crossbow bolt with his sword. I mean, that's huge, absolutely huge. So, what did you think of the fight scene? God, I hope that you really liked that.
No, I really did. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I like the the way that it starts off with the crossbow and he knocks it down and then he just starts taking those guys out. It was very impressive.
One of the things that I actually really liked about that fight scene was the moment that they move to Renfri. There is something, excuse me, there is something sort of almost ethereal about the way that Renfri and he are fighting. They are so well matched that strike for strike, it feels like there is something really powerful going on. And you know, this is a Witcher. This isn't just some fighting guy, you know, some guy that just like picked up a sword. He's really well trained. So it gives you the idea that Renfri really was a super powerfully trained person who, I mean, in the end, she ends up dying, but just the fact that she was able to go toe to toe with him for so long was just absolutely astounding to me. I really loved how long they actually protracted that.
Yeah. And then, you know, when he gets the better of her, I like, you know, the scene, you know, it was like it was two warriors that had a lot of respect for each other.
There were, I think, 3 separate times when he basically had the upper hand on her and she could have walked away and she didn't each time. And it wasn't until the last time when he actually had the sword at her throat and she still tried to drive at him that I think he finally understood, okay, this isn't going to work. I mean, you can't get redemption if you don't want redemption. You know, there's nothing here if you're not going to take it. And it felt really pivotal. It also, you know, we know from sort of how Geralt organizes his own thinking that this has a huge impact on him. Killing humans is not something that he likes to do. And he obviously shared very intimate moments with her in the forest. I can't imagine that it felt to him like this was not, it wasn't going to weigh huge on him for a long time. You know what I mean?
Right. Killing humans is not what I like to do either. So
I have a couple. Yeah, I'm just joking.
I could definitely relate to it being difficult. So no, but
And that line about him not wanting to use silver on her was also just like, it was actually almost heartbreaking. Magic doesn't work on me, and then she said silver does, and he was like, silver is for monsters. Like, even at that point, he was not ready to say that she was a monster. I just absolutely loved that.
yeah, no, that was cool.
So I feel like that actually wraps up sort of all of the high points of this episode. And I know it was a little bit longer than maybe even normal, but there was a lot to get through and a lot of sort of back stuff to kind of deal with. And going forward, I think things might be a little bit more straightforward.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to what comes next. It was a great start, and we'll see what happens going forward.
I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. All right. So how can we get you in social media and all that good stuff?
You can find me on Twitter at followingbliss1, and you can check out my websites at moviesmakethemeal.com. Lots of recipes to go along with your movie watching choices. And you can check out my new site, which is still sort of in development and launch, called studiowhitewolf.com.
All right. And you guys can get me at Kinte F on Twitter, Kinte Ferguson on Instagram. And of course, the website is indyradio.org. That's indyradio.org. And we will be back with another episode. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this all shakes out. So with that said, you guys have a great rest of your weekend.